Hey everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our 5-minute Bible study, our daily study. We're trying to go through one chapter of the Bible every day till we finish the whole thing. That would be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Lord willing, we will. Today we are in Exodus chapter 3. Download the handout that you're about to see up on the screen on our website for free if you want that. Let's talk about when the events of Exodus chapter 3 took place. Well, Moses, who we were introduced to in the last chapter, he was born approximately 1591 BC. And he left Egypt when he was 40 years old, according to Acts chapter 7, verse 23. Moses was close to 80 years old when he spoke to God on Mount Sinai, which is what we're going to talk about in this chapter. In terms of our characters, we've really only got two main ones. I haven't included God as a character in a lot of these chapters because he's kind of course it's talking about God, right? He's the one who's running this entire story. But we have the Israelites, or the Hebrews, as we mentioned. They were the descendants of Jacob, and they were called the Israelites because Jacob had his name changed to Israel by God. Currently, in Exodus chapter 3, during that time, they were enslaved in Egypt by the Egyptians. And then we have Moses. Moses was a Hebrew who grew up in the house of Pharaoh. He had to flee Egypt when he was 40 years old because his murder of an Egyptian was discovered. He then moved to Midian, but he wasn't going to remain there forever because God intended to use him to free the people of Israel from slavery. Where did these events take place? Well, the key location in this chapter is Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, and you'd actually be surprised just how much debate there is regarding the location of Mount Sinai. I have placed two mountains on the map on the handout of the kind of the traditional location of Mount Sinai. That's in the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. And then we have another suggested location for where Mount Sinai is over in Arabia. And there's a lot of debate, and there's even other locations where people propose that Mount Sinai could be. We're going to use the traditional location for most of this study, but if it's something that you're really into, I definitely encourage you to study it. There's a lot of factors to take into account. In terms of our outline, we've only got one major section here. It's verses 1 through 22, the entire chapter, Moses and the burning bush. So Moses was shepherding his father-in-law Jethro's flocks near, he was in Midian. He was on the west side of Mount Horeb, or Sinai, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and talked to him in a flame. Moses saw a bush that was on fire, but the bush wasn't being charred. It wasn't being burned up. God called to Moses out of the burning bush, and he told him to remove his sandals because he was standing on holy ground. God introduced himself as the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, which would have been Moses' forefathers. Those people were known to everyone within the Jewish nation. He told Moses that he planned to keep his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and deliver the Israelites from Egyptian slavery and to bring them into the land of Canaan, which he described as, quote, a land flowing with milk and honey. And then God told Moses that Moses was going to be his representative before Pharaoh, but Moses wasn't confident that he was actually the man for the job. God reassured Moses that he was the man for the job, that God was going to be with him, and that Moses was going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, and they were going to meet with God on the very mountain on which God was speaking to Moses in this chapter. When Moses asked God his name, he said, when I go to the children of Israel, how should I refer to you? And God said that his name was, quote, I am who I am. Moses was to tell the Israelites that I am was going to free them from slavery. Moses was to go to Pharaoh and to tell him that the God of the Hebrews wanted his people to be released from slavery for 3 days to go out into the wilderness and to make sacrifices. Now, God knew ahead of time, he foretold that Pharaoh would not allow the Hebrews to do this, and that God would have to stretch out his hand against Egypt and humble them with wonders from heaven. And what he's referring to there is the 10 plagues, if you know that story, which we're going to read about very shortly. And so that is I'm so used to saying that. That is Exodus chapter 2. Now let's talk about an application. Are God's promises that he made in the scriptures still valid today? The New Testament scriptures were written almost 2,000 years ago. Can we really rely on God even though that much time has passed? Well, this chapter shows us that God's promises remain valid no matter how much time has passed. Back in Genesis chapter 15, God promised Abraham that his descendants would be delivered from their oppressors and they would be led back to the land of Canaan. Moses was now being called in Exodus chapter 3 to be part of the fulfillment of that promise. Well, the promise to Abraham was made almost 400 years before the events of Moses at the burning bush. Right? And so this chapter shows us that God never has and he never will break his promises. His promises are just as trustworthy today as they were 2,000 years ago and will be 2,000 years from now.